So, $6,000 for a camera that only shoots 28mm fixed focal length is frankly a ridiculous amount of money. Yet I sit here roughly a week or so after owning a Leica Q3, inexplicably in love with this camera. Or maybe that's not quite right, there are absolutely reasons, I'm just not sure they justify the cost. So let's talk about the Leica Q3, why in any way, shape or form I could justify this to you, whether you should spend that amount of money on a camera like this, when you could actually buy 6 of these for the price of 1 of these. This is the Ricoh GR3, and it's also a 28mm fixed focal length camera, and this is a brilliant little camera. It captures some fantastic images, so why would you spend your money on something dramatically more expensive? So the elephant in the room, the price. We're addressing this at the top of the video because it was of course paramount to a Leica and the discussion around Leica cameras. This is actually the first Leica that I've actually ever owned. I have always wanted to, as I'm sure a lot of you guys watching this video have also that same experience. There's something kind of alluring about the brand, but my goodness, these cameras are expensive. I do actually think that the Q3 is not a bad value proposition. For one, obviously it is a beautiful camera, as you can tell. It's just a gorgeous piece of hardware. The entire thing is metal. The most compelling argument for its value is actually the lens. So this is a 28mm f1.7 Summilux lens, and the lens on its own is thousands of dollars if you buy it for an interchangeable lens camera. So by actually purchasing the Q3, you're getting access to this lens. Of course, you can't detach it and you have to shoot with this on this body, but there's actually an argument to make for the fact that the camera is actually not as expensive as it would seem. Obviously, the lens itself is absurdly expensive and there's other options for 28mm, but it is just a fantastic, beautiful lens with gorgeous clarity, fantastic color reproduction. Not to mention, it is just absolutely beautiful. Look at that. So when we're talking about the price, I think this is a good time to talk about the Ricoh GR3. Like, I don't want to, this isn't a comparison between the two cameras, but I do think it's an interesting talking point because of the fact that this is a 28mm, this is also a 28mm camera. Okay, so whilst this isn't a formal image comparison, I do want to just jump into Lightroom and go through a couple of these photos side by side. So hopefully you can, one, see almost like the quality difference between the two, because of course there is a difference, but I think side by side you'll realize almost like how kind of almost like not noticeable it actually is. So we have two images here. This one's the Ricoh image. This is the Leica image. I'm going to reset because I've got one of my Fake Film Club presets on there. So that is the kind of a standard straight out of camera. Let's reset that as well. So first of all, with a profile correction, things will look just a little bit closer. And then what I think we'll do is we'll just boost this to look a little bit more like a kind of correct exposure image. As you can see from the image here, things are like, it's a lovely image. Like, let's look before and after. Let's move on to the Leica here. You can see the biggest difference. So if we actually zoom in here, you can see the biggest difference is simply the resolution. Not to mention, you're obviously getting access to a far higher quality lens. This goes down to I believe a 1.7. This is shot at f3.2, this is at f2.8, but you can see how much detail, like that could be cropped as an image and you're actually probably be able to use that as a standalone photo. You can't do that with the Ricoh. Things do start to break down. It's just not as kind of crystal clear in terms of resolution. So there clearly is a difference in terms of the optics, but it's of course not fully like for like, but you can see what I mean. Like, it still looks like a brilliant photograph, kind of regardless of which camera you were to take it on. So let's move on to a different image here. This is the Leica image. What we'll do is we'll reset both of these photos. That's the Leica, that's the Ricoh, and I'm actually going to use a preset this time. So we'll use one of my Fake Film Club presets. So first of all, on the Leica, I will just add a profile correction just to get things a little bit closer. So I'm going to go with gold 200, I think, on here, and we will just bring the highlights down and the exposure down as well. Let's hit before and after. Yeah, I think that is looking really, really nice. We'll do the same thing. Let's add a gold 200 preset. and I'm going to actually blow out the highlights just a little bit more on this one. And you can see side by side how nice but also how similar these two images actually are. Like I said, the biggest difference is probably the resolution, but also the color reproduction. But I did just want to put them side by side so you can kind of gives you a good illustration of, yes, the Leica is superior, but you can also produce great results with something a lot cheaper. Obviously, it's still a pricey camera, of it coming in at $1,000-ish, but the kind of sacrifices for the price are on the things like the build quality, the size, the shooting experience, which obviously when we're talking about the Leica Q3 is of paramount importance. The experience of taking photos with the Leica Q3 and a Leica in general is actually part of the product, not just the product itself. So obviously we've talked about 28mm, but the fixed focal length at 28 is something which I have not shot with before. I've shot a lot with 35. I use 28 in video work, but for the most part I tend to stick with 35 when it comes to photography. So this is a little bit wider than I've actually previously used. I did enjoy it. The one thing that I would say is, particularly when you're shooting street photography, which is, I guess this is primarily a street photography camera for myself, I actually don't love getting up kind of really in people's faces, very obviously shooting. And again, that's an example where these two cameras perform very differently. People aren't going to notice you with something like a Ricoh. And I'll give you an example. So the other day I went to a gig and I took the Ricoh in, probably got the best images in the entire room compared to everyone taking images on their phones. I mean, you'd expect it with a camera like this. I would not have been let in there with this camera. So if you actually look at these things side by side, like obviously absolutely tiny, people don't notice you with this. It is tiny and you're able to get into areas and shoot things which you just wouldn't be able to otherwise. Whereas a Leica, whilst it's not a massive camera, it is still far more kind of obvious that you're shooting with it, and people are going to be aware that you are taking their photo. If you combine that with the fact that 28 is quite a wide focal length, you actually do have to get relatively close to your subject, and that is one area where the Leica really supersedes something like the Ricoh, because the Leica sensor is actually a 60 megapixel sensor. It is a gorgeous sensor, and it means you can crop in dramatically on these photos and still essentially have just a fantastic looking image without almost any quality reduction. I know you can actually also purchase the Leica Q3 43mm, I think it is, and that literally is essentially exactly the same camera but with a 43mm equivalent. So obviously you're splitting the difference over 35mm. That probably would be too close for me, and the 28 I think is a little bit far away. I'm probably just totally biased towards 35mm when it comes to photography, but the 43mm option is there if you are interested. Like overall, I'm really enjoying shooting with 28. It is an interesting kind of challenge when it comes to photography because I haven't shot with a focal length like this before. I'm particularly excited to bring this camera traveling because I think that it will be fantastic for things like landscapes, cityscapes, architecture, that type of thing. Whereas I do think potentially for my style of street, maybe this will change. It is just a little bit far away, but like I said, I'm kind of embracing the challenge. So like I said, the photography experience is paramount when it comes to shooting with a Leica. Like that is what you are buying into with the brand. It's a similar thing to the Hasselblad experience, and we will talk about that because I previously have owned the Hasselblad X2 D100C. But this camera, in terms of accessories, so that is something which some of you guys might find interesting. As you can see, I have a thumb grip on here, so that basically allows me to grip the camera. It just adds an opposing area where you can hold the camera like this. It just slots into the hot shoe. I'll link all of the accessories that I have for this camera down below in the description if you are interested. Both of them are like knockoff brands. I haven't bought the official Leica accessories, but that's the thumb grip. And then the other thing that I purchased is the kind of handle here. That combined with the thumb grip adds a really nice way of shooting, in my opinion. You can just kind of like, especially when you're shooting using the EVF like this, it's just a very pleasurable thing to hold in your hand. You feel like you are capturing a moment in time. It almost feels like you're shooting with film. It's very intentional, and that very much is part of the Leica brand and the Leica experience. I mentioned Hasselblad previously. Like I said, I did own and have done videos on the Hasselblad X2D 100C. It is a brilliant camera in terms of image quality, but almost everything else was very challenging with that camera. Like the autofocus wasn't very good, and I just think, especially when you're shooting with something like medium format, 100 megapixels of fidelity, if your autofocus isn't good, it's going to basically just be a real struggle. Whereas still, I was able to nail focus on almost everything that I was doing every single time. I was using the spot autofocus most and just reducing the kind of spot size just down to the smallest setting, and it was just pretty much able to nail focus almost each and every time. So if you have those two shooting experiences, you've got something like the Hasselblad, which is gorgeous image-wise, but just everything about using the camera is actually pretty difficult. Like, it's slow, the autofocus isn't great. Basically, this ticks all of the boxes that I thought that camera was going to tick. The autofocus is great. It's not dramatically heavy. The shooting experience is beautiful. The images are beautiful. I don't need something like 100 megapixels. Anyway, 60 is probably a little bit overkill, but it does give you the ability to crop in. So all in all, it's just a brilliant experience. So there are two things that I want to talk about with this camera, which are not positive, but they're just some kind of thoughts and musings as a photographer and someone who has just bought this camera for the first time. So the first is, like a lot of places nowadays, London is not that safe. What I mean by that is I don't want to be a scaremonger. Like, you really don't have to worry too much. But if you kind of walk around with a very expensive watch, a very expensive camera, like, you will get noticed. And it is something, if you're not careful and if you're kind of going to flaunt stuff around, it's something which potentially could get targeted for, at risk of. And a camera like this is very obviously, to anyone who is kind of, especially if someone was looking out for something like this, it's very clear that it's an expensive piece of kit. So that is an element that I have been kind of concerned about. Like, it is not like a Fuji X100VI, which of course is a really popular camera, but if it was to get stolen, it's potentially $1,500 or £1,500 worth of value, not £5,000 to £6,000 worth of value here in the UK. So that is a real consideration, and it's something which is really sad for me to talk about as a photographer. Like, it's not something which I want to be considerate of, the fact that, if my camera gets stolen, it's obviously a really large investment, but it is unfortunately a reality of the world that we live in. I've kind of seen different people talk about different things. For one, you can like cover your Leica dot with tape, and some people talk about that as a way to kind of make the camera a little bit more incognito. But I just think it is quite a large camera for, as far as almost like kind of like handheld point and shoot type cameras go. It's not that incognito, so that it definitely is an element. I don't really have any answers for you or kind of ways to sum that up. I just think it's something which is important to be talked about. If, for instance, you live in kind of a city with more crime, that is something which you are going to have to be aware of. The next is the fact that now I have owned cameras from both of the kind of like, let's call them the big two of photography brands. So you've got Hasselblad and now Leica. There definitely was an element of, with the Hasselblad, like, I was disappointed by its performance overall. Like, it is a gorgeous piece of photography equipment, and it produces fantastic images, and there'll be some pros that produce like the most unbelievable images with that camera. But I do think there's an element that they're essentially kind of like relying on their name to kind of keep that camera where it is in the market. And I was reluctant to purchase a camera like the Leica, or just a Leica in the first place, because I was worried essentially that the same thing might be true. Is this camera good enough to actually compete with a lot of these more modern camera brands, Canon, Sony, the fact that they are technically so much more superior really in almost every way compared to something like a Leica? What the Leica is relying on is its shooting experience, the actual tangible experience of taking a shot, but also things like the optics and the color science, things which are a little bit harder or a little bit more kind of difficult to prove. And like from my first few shooting experiences with this camera, I think that this is like the almost like the opposite to the Hasselblad experience, and it seems like this produces unbelievably good images, beautiful optics, beautiful color rendition. It's definitely the most fun that I've had shooting with a new camera in a long time. And this is where we kind of come on to the final question of the video. And obviously this is a totally unique question to you. Is it worth it? Is it worth you spending the money on something like this? I think for me, I may be able to use this in a professional environment. So that obviously automatically means I'm going to be able to use it for my job. It starts becoming an investment. I am likely to get a return on that investment. If I was just going like for like, I would really give the Ricoh a go because it's a fantastic camera and it shoots 28 as well. You are really going to struggle to see the difference side by side, which hopefully I've proven across the course of this video. When you actually look at images side by side between these two cameras, it becomes much more a question of how much is the shooting experience worth it for you? What type of shooting are you doing? Are you going traveling where you kind of need a really, really small form factor camera? And really that is of course a very personal decision. It's something which hopefully across the course of this video you might have answered.